I'd like to welcome Julian, is it Routh? Routh of the Sutton, Coldfield and North Birmingham Beekeepers Association. So are you able to talk a little bit about beekeeping and the association and the work the association does?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to talk on all of that. So Sutton Coldfield Beekeepers Association has been in existence since the late 19th century, certainly.
Yeah.
We've forgotten the exact date, none of us were around then. But it's been very active in beekeeping over that period.
Yeah.
I know of one of my friend's father who did a lot of lecturing in the 30s and 40s. He's still active. He's a little bit older than me. He was basically brought up with beekeeping.
Yeah.
And we've had a consistent number of members of our branch active nationally as well as locally. We've got at the moment about 80 members in the Sutton Coldfield North Birmingham area, which will equate to about 400, 500 hives between them.
Yeah.
And we're all hobbyists, no professional beekeepers of any sort.
Yeah.
It's been a hobby for all of us.
Yeah.
For a long time in some of our cases.
So did you get into it because you were fascinated in insects and then bees followed, or?
Slightly different from that. I've always been interested in insects. My father was a very keen entomologist.
Yeah.
And from my very youngest age, we were brought up looking at talking about insects.
Yeah.
Which continues an interest. But the crunch really came in the 70s when we had children. I was lucky enough to have a big garden. I grew most of our own vegetables. But when children came along after we were married in the late 70s, our other hobbies that took us away most weekends became impossible.
Yeah.
So as part of the self-sustainability movement of the 70s, most people's times, I decided to add beekeeping to my other self-sufficiency bit. I grew nearly all our own vegetables, so beekeeping was an added extra.
Yeah. So was that the honey they produce? Was that a part of the self-sufficiency, or is it more complicated than that?
It's a lot more complicated than that. The honey's obviously a benefit, but it's really a chance to study insects through their entire life cycle and how it works as a colony, because you get literally a very intimate view of the bees when working and studying them.
Yeah.
And I've also now got 3 different apiaries close to Sutton, one in our garden in the middle of Sutton, one at Newhall Mill, which is Country Park, and then one out at the farm out at Minworth, which is primarily agricultural. And that is to study how the colonies of bees work differently in those different areas, even though they're relatively close to each other.
Do each colony have its own language? In terms of how they communicate, is that different between colonies?
The language isn't different. The identity is different.
Yeah.
And that's based on pheromones, scent messages, which are primarily generated by the queen. But nobody fully understands how each individual scent message is derived. But each colony will have its own individual scent and recognise bees from different colonies and send them away, basically. So you can have 2 hives sitting next to each other, and the own bees will come back to their own hives.
Yeah. And do they ever get mistaken? Or are they certain know where to go? Do they ever go to the wrong hive?
They're pretty good on it.
Yeah.
Nothing's ever 100% in nature, so there is a bit of drifting between colonies, but it's a very small amount.
And are they quite protective of bees from different colonies coming into their hive? Or
very protective. This time of year, when they're getting ready for winter, they've got their winter stores ready. They get very protective against bees, wasps, beekeepers, you name it, at this time of year. But normally they will repel bees from other colonies, although they will normally let a forager who's got a good store of nectar on her come into the hive and not repel her.
Because of the nectar?
Because of the nectar,
Will they kind of take that bee as their own, or just use it for the nectar?
Just use the nectar generally.
And when will she fly away to her own colony?
She'll definitely fly away and probably go back to her colony. But when you've got tens of thousands of nearly identical insects, it's very difficult to determine what an individual one does.
Yeah. The other question I'm interested in knowing, in terms of a colony, are the worker bees, the queen bee obviously, are there different classifications of bee?
There's one queen per colony.
Yeah.
Under virtually all circumstances. There are certain circumstances, but realistically one queen. The number of workers, who are all infertile females, will vary between 60,000 down to, going into winter, probably 25,000. There'll be some drones, male bees, but they're only there during the summer. I'd be very worried about a colony that had got drones in the moment, because they only keep them when there's a need to mate with queens.
Really?
So generally by the end of July, they'll throw all the drones out.
Okay. But
between the workers, they do have different tasks, but it's essentially age-based, because their bodies develop during the lifespan. The lifespan's about 6 weeks for a worker bee. Mm-hmm. And when they first emerge, there'll be house cleaner bees, nurse bees, that feed the larvae and generally tidy up the hive and keep it clean. As they do their stings or their venom sacs will develop after about 12 days. They then start becoming guard bees, other bees. And then when they're about 3 weeks old, they'll become foragers. And they'll go out and collect water, nectar, pollen, and propolis, which is a nectar they get, resin they get from trees.
Okay.
And they'll do that for the last 3 weeks of their life.
Do bees actually drink? In terms of, I've never seen a bee drink. I mean, I assume they get...
In that they take in nectar, and their prime collection is nectar.
Yeah.
They take that in through their mouth or mouth parts.
Yeah.
And store it in a honey crop.
Yeah.
So whether that's drinking or not. But they do also collect water, which at various times, in the hot summer, they'll use that for cooling down the hive with a sort of inbuilt air conditioning system. Later on in the winter, when they're using the honey stores, they need water to dilute the honey, because the honey itself is too strong for them to use. They have to dilute it down. Okay. And they need water for that.
So, apologies if this is incorrect. Do they collect the nectar, take it back to the hive? Does that nectar, become honey? And is that what they eat? Is that how it works?
Nearly. They'll bring nectar back to the hive during the summer period, when there's lots of forage, lots of nectar from the plants in spring through to round about now. They'll eat the nectar or use the nectar direct. They've got their honey crops. Yeah. That's got a little valve at the end of it, which will allow some of it through to their proper stomach. So they will take some of it, and that's their energy source. Yeah. The rest of it gets various enzymes added to it and brought back, and will be concentrated in the hive to make honey. Okay. The honey is a food store for the winter, because fairly obviously there's very few flowers in the winter. And as a colony, which will drop down to 15,000, 20,000 bees during the winter, they need a food store to last them right through to the spring next year. And that's what the honey is for. It's their store for the winter. So they digest some of the nectar. Yes. And they retain some of that. And the rest of it gets regurgitated with some enzymes added. Yeah. Then that gets spread on the inside of the honeycomb cells. Yeah. And the water's evaporated off, and that will get concentrated to become honey. Okay. Nectar's typically between 10% and 25% sugar. Yeah. Honey's 83% sugar normally. So they evaporate it off, and the sugars in nectar are primarily sucrose, the same as granulated sugar. Yeah. That actually gets broken down into glucose and fructose in the by the enzymes,
Yeah.
which is more digestible and stores better.
Yeah. What is that? Sometimes when I've seen bees, they've got like a yellow ball on their leg.
That's pollen.
Is that what
they actively collect pollen?
Yeah.
And that is their nitrogen source, protein source. Nectar from flowers is almost pure carbohydrate.
Yeah.
They need other minerals and nitrogen and protein sources. And that's what they get from the pollen. A small amount of that is used by the adult bees, but very little. Most of it is used for generating food for the larvae. Initially, when the larvae are very young, they get fed brood food, which is a secretion produced in glands in the head of the bee. And as they get a little bit older, they'll then be fed nectar and pollen, and that's the nitrogenous source that builds up the bodies of the larvae.
Yeah. So that's another food source.
Another food
the
source,
pollen,
yes.
And that gets taken back to the hive, and then enzymes change it, or
not much. The prime change is in glands in the heads of the bees.
So the bees eat that first.
They eat that.
Yeah.
And it's taken inside their body.
Yeah.
Glands produce what's called brood food.
Yeah.
But later on, they'll actually feed the larvae nectar and pollen as the larvae get a bit older. After about 3 days old, or 6 days since the egg being laid, they'll be then fed nectar and pollen.
How is this fed? Is it like penguins or birds regurgitate food into the larvae, or is it just kept somewhere?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, pretty well the same.
And would that be the worker bee that goes to the larvae?
That would be the nurse bees.
Okay.
That do all that. The younger bees will collect the nectar from the foragers and then feed that to the larvae.
Okay.
Other bees, when there's an excess of nectar, will take that and change it into honey.
And do the nursery bees grow up to foragers?
Yes.
Okay, so that's just one.
It's a time-based system. When they're young, most of the nurse bees and the house cleaners are less than 12 days old.
Most of the worker bees are female.
They're all female.
They're all female. The drones are male?
The drones are male, yes.
And the drones, what is their use again?
Essentially mating with queens.
Okay.
Full stop.
And so how many drones would you get in a colony, like 20%?
No, it'll be 2 or 3% generally.
Yeah. And does the queen need to be continually mated with?
No. There's no mating inside the hive.
Yeah.
When a new queen is generated, and we'll probably come to that later, she will fly from the hive to what are called drone congregation areas.
Yeah.
And drones from many colonies will congregate in these areas. Nobody quite understands how they're formed. And then she will send out chemical attractant and another pheromone, and the drones will chase her, and the fastest one catches her and mates with her. And she will mate in 1 or maybe 2 flights with between 10 and 20 drones. And she'll store all that semen in a small organ in her body, and that's lasting for the rest of her life.
And how long do they live for?
Queens nowadays, it's a difficult statement. They live 2 or 3 years, the queen bee. Before we had certain pests on disease, when I started in the 70s, I've kept queens lean for 7 years.
Okay.
It doesn't happen anymore because their lives shortened for various reasons.
Yeah. And is the queen larger? Is she obviously different?
She's about half as long again
as
the other bees. Most of that is an extension or abdomen.
Yeah.
Because worker bees have only got vestigial ovaries, 1 or 2 of areoles. The queen's going to have 180, 200 of areoles, which are the egg-laying machines inside her body, and they occupy nearly all her abdomen. She's also got other differences. Her sting is different. A worker bee's sting is barbed, but the queen bee's sting is only ever used for stinging other queens if there's a fight.
Okay.
And it hasn't got a barb on it. It's smooth.
Yeah.
Her eyes are different. Her legs are different because she's got no need to saw the pollen on her legs. And her antennae and mouth parts are different. So if you look closely, you can see all those differences.
So she's adapted for her role.
Yes.
And the other bees, likewise, for what they do.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Just a few quick questions about an apiary. Is that the location of the hive?
It's a collection of hives. It can be one, it can be more.
Okay. And is there there's a word, a skep? Is that the hive itself, or is that something else?
A skep is something else. A skep is a straw hive that is skep shaped.
Yeah.
You know the shape. And that was the main method of keeping bees between the earliest we know is the 11th century, and they started going out of use in the middle of the 19th century. So they had sort of 800 plus years of use.
Yeah.
I've kept bees in skeps out of interest back in the 80s. I've got a skep at the moment I use for swarms, but it is simply a hollow container of approximately the right size for a colony of bees. But nowadays, we actively discourage people for using them for several reasons. One is they're not really big enough for a good colony of bees. There's no way of checking them for disease. And when bees were kept in skeps, the only way to take honey off them was to kill the bees.
Okay.
And skep beekeeping, for the majority of its time, you'd keep a large number of colonies. You'd kill off the lightest third because they wouldn't get through the winter, and take away the wax and the honey, and the heaviest third because there was a good honey. And the middle third you would keep through the winter and expect them to swarm to recolonize all your skeps the next year. Okay. So for 800 plus, well, it's a lot longer than that because the oldest hives we know go back to 4,500 BC in Egypt, which have used a clay hive, similar principle. So for the vast majority of time that bees have been kept and managed by man, they've wanted to encourage swarming to recolonize colonies they'd taken all the honey off. It was realised that killing off 2/3 of your bees every year is probably not the best of ways of doing things. And there were discoveries made in the 1850s primarily that discovered a better way of doing it, allowing movable frame hives, which we use, boxes of approximately the right size for bees, and it allows us to keep the bees in a colony, and then when they want to swarm, we get essentially 8 days or more notice of that. We can do what's artificially swarm, generate a second colony, and save all the bees basically. So we keep our bees, we keep the honey stock, and keep the whole thing under control. Nowadays, swarms are seen as a bit of a nuisance to people. Go back 200 years, they were seen as an important benefit. But the beekeepers, skep beekeepers, in some ways had an idyllic life because the only way of tracking the swarms you know you're going to lose was literally to sit there and watch them. So if you've got the luxury of being able to sit in your apiary watching all your bees, then chasing swarms as they emerge, that's fine, but that doesn't exactly fit with modern lifestyles.
Do swarms travel far? I mean, will they go tens of miles, hundreds of miles?
No, they won't go that far. It's normally reckoned that they'll go up to 5 kilometres. Yeah. The reason for that is that essentially that's as far as a bee's fuel source. If it's got a full stock of honey or nectar on board, it runs out of fuel after much more than that. So it can go a bit further, but it'll run out of fuel basically.
In terms of ants, termites, bees, who have very complicated hierarchies and societies, I mean, is a bee comparable? Is it more sophisticated than an ant colony? Are they similar, or are they very different?
In some ways, they're very different.
Yeah.
Ants and bees are both Hymenoptera, so the same sort of family of insects. Termites are a different family of insects that have developed social means independently. But an ant colony can get very much bigger than a bee colony. A bee colony is going to stay in its hive. An ideal cavity is between 40 and 60 litres. It'll expand and contract within that colony. The queen, there'll only be one queen, and that size. But an ant colony, certainly some of the tropical ants and some of the ones in this country, have enormous colonies. There was some work done in the 80s by Adam Hart looking at leafcutter ants. And these leafcutters had tens of millions of bees in them and spread over enormous areas. They'd go deep in the ground, they'd spread over. And there's one ant in this country, it's an invasive ant, but it invaded a while ago, that has fully interconnected colonies with multiple queens, but they're all interconnected, so they work a very different sort of social life, and those colonies can be acres in size.
Really?
So completely different sort of life.
It is fascinating. So much I didn't know, and I quite like listening and watching about insects, particularly ones that have complicated hierarchies, a language, very layered society. Each one has a specific job.
Yeah.
I find them very fascinating because it's kind of similar to human society, where you've got your soldiers, your high, upper level of government. So it is fascinating. I saw a picture of a black bee. I think it was on a local Facebook group, and it kind of doesn't look like a bee at all. Yeah. I don't know if it's a solitary type of bee.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
What people don't realise when talking about bees in general, we've got approximately 270 species of bees in this country.
Yeah.
One honeybee. There's about 24 species of bumblebees, although that's under debate because we had a new one come in the late 20th century, obviously ignore them, and we may have lost some of the species, but they find odd ones in remote places. And the other 250 or so are all solitary bees. And the reasons nobody's quite sure of the number is we keep finding new ones. There's been introductions coming across the channel.
Yeah. The
latest one is a very big bee, the violet carpenter bee, which was a South Mediterranean species. And I've seen them on the Mediterranean coast in Greece. I last saw them. But there's now a colony in Bedfordshire.
Yeah.
And this is undoubtedly due to almost certainly climate change.
Yeah.
There's another bee that's a fairly recent introduction. One of the solitary bees, and it's typical of solitary bees, in that it only feeds on ivy. The ivy isn't in flower yet. It won't be in flower for another few weeks. So the adults are only present when the ivy's in flower, so a period of 4 to 6 weeks. That will be the adult lifestyle. They'll mate, they'll form a nest, lay eggs, which they'll put on pollen moistened with nectar. They'll be inside the stems of plants, I think, for Coletus hedera. Then the eggs will emerge, feed on the pollen, pupate, and they won't emerge until end of September next year when the ivy comes in flower. Now, nearly all the solitary bees are tied in with various flower crops.
Okay.
One that's very common around here, a little mining bee. You see little volcanoes on your lawn on sandy soils.
Yeah.
They tie up, the Andrena species, they tie up with apple blossom. So you'll see them in the spring. It'll be there for a few weeks, apparently disappear. Then next year, you'll see their young. So a completely different sort of structure.
Are you ever concerned that one of these invasive species might be aggressive towards the local indigenous bees, like the honeybee? Kind of like grey squirrels destroying their habitat or taking over the territory of the red squirrel in a similar way?
Not of the bees, because the classic one is Bombus hypnorum, the tree bumblebee, which came in 2002, we think, but it may be that. And it was first spotted in the south of England. It was common on the continent. That has now spread up past the Scottish border. And it's unusual amongst bumblebee, its name gives it away. It nests high up. So if you've got bees in a bird box or bees in your soffit or fascia of your house, it's almost certainly Bombus hypnorum, the tree bumblebee.
Okay.
Because all the other species are ground nesting.
Okay.
And you'll see that quite happily foraging on flowers with other bumblebee species. There might be 4 or 5 on flowers, and there doesn't seem to be any competition. There's enough forage around. There's no competition for nest spacing because they're very different. And they've got right up at the country in 20 or so years, so they haven't suffered.
Yeah.
And we don't think other bumblebees have suffered. On the other hand, there is an invasive hornet that is a Chinese or Chinese-Korean border. It came from Vespa velutina, and that came into France in 2004, imported, I think, in the straw round bonsai pots, so it was hibernating in the straw. That's now completely in France. It's in Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, you name it. And it's now almost certainly endemic in Jersey. And we get occasional incursions into this country. We've had a few each year since 2016. But that's a hornet, slightly smaller than the European hornet, but it actively predates on honeybees and honeybee colonies.
Okay.
So I've seen plenty of videos from France, there's loads around on YouTube and things, that they will literally hawk outside a beehive and catch the foragers coming in because they're heavily loaded. They're
slow.
But the queens overwinter, as with all wasp species. They will form a small initial nest, primary nest, and then some of the workers will go looking for a good source of insects. And a beehive is a really good source of insects. And then they will form a secondary nest close to that beehive, or several beehives, which is unusual amongst wasp species. And they can, once they've weakened the hive, go in and completely kill off the hives.
So they eat the bees?
They eat the bees. You can get a video on YouTube, just look for Asian hornet. What they'll do to catch the bees, they'll go and sit on a local branch. They'll take the bee apart, because what they're really interested in is all the muscles inside the thorax, the wing flight muscles. And they take those back and feed those to their larvae, which, like all wasp larvae, are carnivorous. And they're quite big nests. They need a lot of insect flesh. And they actively predate on bees. And last week was Asian Hornet Week, because we're beginning to see the workers, and we've had a lot of publicity amongst beehives to keep eyes on their colony, because this is when you start to see the worker hornets hawking around the beehives to build their colonies up for later in the year. But I haven't seen any reports of them yet on mainland UK. Jersey's had a lot this year.
Yeah.
But that's a very worrying import.
In terms of threats to honeybees, what would you say are the single biggest threat?
Well, apart from beekeepers, which is a different sort of problem, they need training, but that's the thing. Pesticides are significant. Big areas of monoculture are difficult because they can't get, there's no single pollen that's got all the necessary amino acids and proteins. So certainly over in East Anglia and the Fens, where they grow these enormous fields of monoculture. Yeah. If it's something like oilseed rape, a lot of forage, but poorly balanced. If it's wheat or barley, no food whatsoever. And they use herbicides to kill off all the wildflowers, which may be wildflowers to the farmers. They're food for the bees. Yeah. So and equally pesticides. And as is being found recently, pesticides, obviously, they kill insects, so they're going to be a problem. But some of the fungicides and herbicides also have additives which have proven to make the toxicity much worse. Some of them are detergents or that sort of compound, which make it much easier for the flowers to absorb the herbicide, which is what's going to kill them off. But it also has a serious effect and makes it much more toxic to bees. And that's not just honeybees, it's all bees. So you're losing all the natural pollinators in some of these areas.
Have you seen a positive response from farmers or the community of farming, in responding to these concerns? I mean, have they changed their chemicals?
There's been a consistent change in chemicals.
For the better?
Yes and no. When I first started in the 70s, most spraying was done by light plane or helicopter. And to put it mildly, they weren't very accurate. You'd see these, if it was a slight breeze, the spray would over big areas. So in those days, spray liaison schemes were set up, which farmers, and hopefully most of the contractors, most of the spraying was contractors, would let beekeepers in the area know, so you could seal your bees in the hive when the spray was around, but it was still on the flowers and things in the area. Spraying of that type hasn't been used for many years, and testing of pesticides has improved. Pesticides, by their very nature, kill insects. They've got better, and the way of application and time of application has improved things markedly. But what has been found recently, as you would have seen a lot in the press about neonicotinoids, they don't necessarily kill the bees, but they disturb their location systems, they shorten their lives. So it's a non-lethal problem with bees. And there's been a lot of work done to understand that, because it doesn't meet with any of the tests that these pesticides are put through. The tests they're put through before release all measure lethality. So what levels kill the bees and try to go below that. They've never considered this condition where it's a sublethal effect and shortens the life and this sort of thing, and may affect the fertility of queens, which, as I said earlier, in the 70s I managed to keep queens alive for 7 years. We're now down to 3 years if you're lucky with queens. So lots of things have changed over the last 40 odd years.
In terms of honeybees population, there was it was in the news several years ago about the decline of the honeybees population, and there was this big push nationally to get people like me plant wildflowers in their garden, leave areas unmowed to encourage wildflowers. Have you seen a decrease in the bee population, the honeybee?
Honeybees, no, because the honeybee population is almost entirely dependent on beekeepers. All the colonies are managed colonies.
Would the population just collapse if the beekeepers pulled out then?
Almost certainly, yes.
Okay.
The reason for that is a parasite that came in the early 90s, Varroa, which, if unmanaged, will usually kill off a colony with 3 or 4 years. So if you don't manage it, it'll kill a colony. And some research work done a few years ago, where a researcher from, I think it was Leeds University, asked people about wild colonies that had been there for a long time. And people have got cavities in trees or some in churches. There's always been bees in there. And she collected a load and went to these colonies over a succession of years and found by DNA analysis, yes, there were bees in the cavity years after years, but it wasn't the same colony. A colony had died off, another swarm had gone in later years. So she didn't find many long-standing colonies. So it's typical. I've got hives that have had colonies in for 20 plus years and they've never died out, but they've always had new queens, new bees.
Yeah.
Everything's changed, but the same cavities had colonies. That rarely happens in nature.
So without you protecting the bees from this parasitic life form?
We're managing it, yes.
And how do you do that exactly?
By many techniques. The parasite called Varroa essentially shortens the life, but it's a very good virus vector as well, and the viruses carried to some of the problems. We'll never get rid of it completely, and what we try and do is keep the numbers down in the hive. There are various chemical methods of doing that. All my hives at this moment have got a treatment to reduce the Varroa population before the bees that go into winter are weakened, because some of those have got to last through till March, April next year. They have a much longer life in winter, and it's very critical in March, April. Even a few weeks shorter life, the colony will die off. So we treat now, but there's various other chemicals that can be used. Some sort of active drug-like ones for which the Varroa becomes rapidly resistant.
Yeah.
Other, for want of a better word, semi-organic ones. The one I use is based on thymol, the compound you get in thyme.
Yeah.
And there's other methods you can use within a hive of isolating sections of brood for periods of time so the Varroa can only go into certain cells. Then you remove those, kill off that brood and kill off the Varroa. So there's some fairly technical methods like that.
What's that word? Varroa?
Varroa, yeah.
And is that, a virus or a parasite?
It's a mite. It's a parasitic mite.
I think I have seen like an X-ray of that thing Is it burrow in the bee? Or
No. What it does, its major problem for bees, it only breeds inside sealed brood cells. So the pupal stages of the bee.
Okay.
It will, a fertilized female, will go into the cell just before it's capped, and she'll start laying eggs at 30-hour intervals. First one will be a male, and then all the subsequent ones will be female, and the male will mate with the female ones, incestuous. And in a worker brood cell, which is in there for 12 days, she will generate just under 2 daughters from each cell. So for every cell she's entered, she will come out with 2 daughters approximately that will then go into other cells, and each female can do about 2 brood cycles. So the numbers can build up very rapidly. But in there they feed on what's termed the fat body of the pupa, which is their equivalent of our liver.
Okay.
So they're feeding on the liver, which obviously weakens the bee, it depresses their immune system, and because it's a food store, it weakens and shortens their life. Sometimes that's so bad it will kill them in the cell. That's usually if 2 or 3 females, Varroa females, have gone in, and all their brood feeding will kill the pupa. They weaken it sometimes, but if it's only one that's gone in, they will come out, but they will spend a short time on adult bees, tucked usually in the segments of their abdomen, and that's how it spreads from colony to colony.
So this parasite's like a little worm or something?
No, it's a little, if it's anything, because it's a mite, it's got 10 legs, it's like a crab, if you like.
Okay.
But it's about 1.9 millimetres wide, 1.2 long, and the legs are essentially under its thing because it can crouch down so the bees can't pull at it.
So it latches into the bee.
Yeah.
The bee then goes into the hive and pass it to the little, what they call pupae?
Pupae, yes.
And that starts to eat them while they're in their pupal stages.
Pupal stages inside a sealed
and either
cell.
Weakens them to the point
that weaken it. But I say the virus vector is an important factor. There's certainly one deformed wing virus, which we know is spread very badly. A lot of study on that. There's possibly some other viruses that are transmitted as well.
And this is another threat to hive.
Yeah, the deformed wing virus which, as its name suggests, deform the wings. The bees can't fly, so they're useless to the colony. And if it's very bad, large numbers of those will be there.
And is the only way you detect this is by visually looking at the wings of the bees as
The deformed wing virus, yes, but the method we use for detecting Varroa, which I've got on all my hives at the moment, we use a mesh floor. The mesh has got a mesh that the bees can't get through, but the Varroa can drop through. We put a board under there, and we look at that after 7 days or so and count the Varroa on it.
Yeah.
Which gives us an idea of how many Varroa there are in the colony. There's various calculators to work out backwards from there how many Varroa there are.
And you can't eliminate it, you have to manage it.
No, there's
Try
no
and
way
keep
of
it low.
eliminating it. And you have to use, realistically, a series of different treatments during the year.
Yeah.
Because there's no one shot that will kill it.
Yeah.
So you use different ones. There's one we can use in the middle of the winter if there's numbers there. There's others we can use in season.
Yeah.
The one I'm using, you can't use when there's honey stores on the colony. It's okay if it's the bees' honey stores.
Yeah.
But for the honey we want to take off as excess, it will get contaminated by the thymol, so we can't use it at that time.
In terms of new beekeepers, is it popular? Have you seen a renewed interest in beekeeping?
We have. We run beginners courses in Sutton. We run a winter course, usually February, March, which is classroom based, although this year it was Zoom based for obvious reasons. And we run a summer course where we take smallish groups. We've taken 16 of aspiring beekeepers, I like to say, because my strongest advice to anybody wanting to keep bees is don't keep bees. Bees have got an incredibly good feedback mechanism if you get things wrong. And we run this course that runs, normally it would run from the beginning of May to mid-September. It's just finished for this year. It's a little bit shorter. But it gives these aspiring beekeepers a chance to see what happens through the season, handle bees with knowledgeable beekeepers and expert people. If they get anything wrong, they just put it down and we sort it out. But they get a chance to handle bees, sees what it's all about, and more importantly, get in contact with other local beekeepers to network and keep in contact with the senior beekeepers. We're always answering questions. I have an open email address to our members. If they've got questions, they can ask me. They see me. We have a weekly Apiary meeting. They see me there. I get asked questions at most of those meetings. So that network is important, especially for newly started beekeepers. And then people on the course, if they want to start, some decide they don't. Occasionally, a couple on the course this year decided 1 year of landing under wanted a second year. They pay for the privilege, but they wanted a second year. We can usually get bees and sometimes equipment for them, and certainly advise them on everything that they need to get. So we like to give them a really good start, because one of the biggest problems, as I alluded to earlier, is people who don't know what they're doing when they get bees, or I hasten to add on this podcast, actually learn from YouTube, which has got some incredibly good stuff. As with everything on YouTube, there's other stuff that maybe not quite so good. You can't learn anything without actually handling bees. You've got to do that ideally before you start, because as I say, get it wrong, they've got a really good feedback mechanism to tell you you've got it wrong.
Is it hard to keep bees? To keep them happy, keep them productive?
Once you know what you're doing, no, it isn't. During the summer, from about early April, it depends on the weather and the season, you need to inspect them once a week. That'll take you 20 minutes to a half hour per hive. And that's really to check for preparation for swarming, whether they've got sufficient food in the colony, whether they're healthy, whether they've got sufficient space in the colony. So half an hour a week or so there. That gets less later in the season when you're fairly sure the swarming instincts, which you just want to leave them get on, increasing forage. And the main thing there is ensuring that they've got enough space and disease-free. And then from really about now, I'm feeding them and treating them Another couple of weeks that'll be finished. And as long as I'm happy that they've got enough food for the winter, the hives are fully sound and weatherproof, I won't touch them again till March. I might check them by putting the Varroa boards in December and treat them then if necessary. But normally between mid-October and March, nothing at all.
Just going back to the swarming point, do bees, is their instinct to migrate every couple of years, or if they're happy, will they stay there forever?
It's not migration, it's reproduction.
Oh,
because I'd say there's one queen per colony.
Yeah.
She's only got a finite life.
Yeah.
2 or 3 years at the moment. To get another colony, you need to get a new queen.
Yeah.
And when the conditions in the hive get to a certain state, it's got a lot of bees, it's congestion, there's forage out there. They'll decide the time is right. And part of that is the queen produces this pheromone that is the hive instinct. That actually gets less and less as she gets older. So the colony cohesion starts to fall apart.
Yeah.
And what they will do is draw some queen cells, which are vertical cells rather than horizontal, either persuade the queen to lay eggs in those or in fact move eggs into those, female eggs, and start feeding that with royal jelly, which is a much richer food, much higher in sugar, so that worker egg or that female egg develops entirely differently from a normal worker. And when they're sure that's going to develop, which is after about 8 days and the cell is sealed, the old queen will leave between a third and a half of the bees to form a new colony.
This is, sorry, the old queen. Okay.
Logic behind that is the old queen can lay eggs as soon as she's there.
Yeah.
The bees can draw comb as soon as they're there. So they'll initially go and form the swarm that you see in books, a nice one hanging on a branch. They'll then look for a suitable cavity. They will go there. They can start drawing wax, and very often, even if they've been stuck in a tree for 3 days or more, you'll find a comb already with eggs in it.
Okay.
And that can get going immediately because there's not many young bees, there's not many nurse bees needs, so they'll all go out foraging, and that can build up quite quickly. The old colony, the queen will emerge after another 8 days, 4 or 5 days to mature outside that. She will then go and mate, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Another few days before that semen is sorted out in her body, then she'll start laying. So you've got a minimum of a 2 or 3 week delay, it may be up to 6 weeks before that colony gets going again.
Yeah.
But they've got all the foragers, they've got all the other brood that was emerging.
Yeah.
So they can pick up after that quite easily.
What happens when that old queen dies? Will she lay another queen knowing that she's about to expire?
Very often the swarm will set up a colony.
Yeah.
And they will do what's called supersede coming into the late summer, August usually. They will draw a cell out, or very few cells, 1 or 2 usually, for a new queen. The old queen will stay there, and as long as that new queen mates, occasionally you see colonies with 2 queens, but the old queen won't come out of the winter.
So she'll eventually die?
She just dies, and the new queen will take over that colony.
And you said that the cells for queens are squared, you say? Right?
No, they're vertical.
Vertical.
They look like elongated acorns, if you like.
Okay.
And they're on the front of the comb, so very different in shape. And the only difference is that egg, or the larvae, is fed with this very rich royal jelly. And the queen will develop from egg to adult in 16 days, whereas a worker takes 21 days.
Yeah.
So it's their reproductive instinct. So you can never stop swarming as such, because as with any animal, you stop it reproducing, it disappears. But what we do, we can see those queen cells being formed on inspection. As I say, it takes 8 days usually before the swarm emerges. So if we check it every 7 days, we can see that, and then we can actually split the colony by various different techniques and fool it into thinking it's swarmed. So we split it into what the 2 halves would be.
Okay.
And there.
So
because they drill multiple queen cells,
Yeah.
we can actually raise more queens than we need. If we've got a good strain of bees, we can actually requeen other colonies.
So you'll see the queen cell is forming.
Yes.
Take that queen how does it work? Do you take
normally what we'd do, we'd leave that queen cell in a colony on the old site move it slightly and then put the old queen on the site, because then all the flying bees will come back to the old site because they'll location. The other one will move away with the queen cell and the brood, and then that will reform a colony. She'll emerge after 8 days, and then you've got 2 colonies. Biggest problem with new beekeepers, they have 1 colony, they've got 2, 4, 6, 8, it's mad, and they just can't manage. And what I tell people, you decide at the beginning of the year how many colonies you want to put into winter and have next year, because if you've got too many, you either give them away to somebody else, you can unite colonies by taking a queen out and combine them to give you a really strong colony going into the winter. But controlling your numbers is an early lesson that people have to learn.
It seems like there's a lot of manipulation, like intervention in terms of managing those colonies. I don't know if that's the right word. To grow in a way that's sustainable, I guess. Like say if you've got too many colonies, then it's going to be very difficult to manage and space, etc.
The key to that is not to get to that stage. But that's what we have to teach people to do.
And if someone sees a honeybee colony in the wild, in a house, in a shed, they can contact local beekeepers.
They normally contact us. If it's a swarm hanging in a train, we've got a list and it's on the BBK website by postcode, so you can find your nearest swarm collector or come and collect it. If it's gone into a building, sometimes it can be far more difficult. When I was much younger, I've taken chimneys apart. That's usually when a chimney's been scaffolded. The builders go up there, find there's a colony of bees in there and panic. And someone like me gets called out. And because at that time, they're having work done on the chimney, there's no problem about dismantling the chimney. But very often, it's too difficult to get them out without destroying a lot of the fabric of the building. And the only option there is to destroy the colony, which is why we like to preempt swarming by collecting it and try not to get the swarms out into the public domain, because they cause more trouble than they're worth.
And you're only interested in honeybees? If there's other types of bumblebee?
An awful lot of our calls, BBK have got a swarm call line, are for other bees. And the first thing that anybody answering the queues, and I trained my children to do this when they used to call me at home and the kids would answer the phone, and they'd go through this routine of asking what type of bees they were and how they were. And people will phone you up if they've got 2 bees in their kitchen and tell you it's a swarm. Classic one, it's over now. A few weeks ago, Cotoneaster was in flower. Bees love Cotoneaster, and you'll get absolutely covered. You know, the first question is it a bush with little red flowers on it? Yeah. Are the bees in a cluster, or are they feeding on the flowers? Feeding on the flower. It's just that they're just feeding on the nectar. Bumblebees, you ask, how many are there? Are they furry? Usually. Are they coloured? Because lots of people simply don't recognise a honeybee as what it is.
Yeah, I'd say I fall into that group. I think everyone thinks of a bee yellow and black, kind of a bit furry. But they're darker, aren't they? There's no yellow and black, really.
They're not yellow and black at all.
And they're smaller, maybe?
They're certainly smaller than bumblebees.
Yeah.
They'll be sort of 10 millimetres long.
Yeah.
They're tawny, and the bands are tawny and dark brown, really.
Yeah.
But that can vary with the genetics of the bee. They can be almost completely dark, or in certain cases, the Italian ones, almost completely light tan. Wide range of colours with the bees. But I've been one. We used to be the Royal Show down at Stoneleigh. We had observation hives there, which I used to man. And I still do the same at Newhall Mill sometimes in Sutton. And people will come up to me and tell me, no, they're not bees. You know, I do beg to do that. That's a section out of a beehive.
Yeah.
I do know what honeybees are. And lots of people will come and tell me they're not bees.
Yeah.
But as I say, we've got 270 species. They're all different, completely different sizes. Honeybee is one of those, and different one. There's quite a lot of solitary bees that are very similar to honeybees, the larger ones.
The website is really good. I'd say it's very simple, very informative, very engaging. It seems a very friendly club. It was nice.
Yeah.
Very welcoming. I think that's everything, Julian. Thank you for talking to me, and hopefully, certainly I have found it very informative, learning something new about bees. Thank you.
So if anybody in the area, the website Sutton Coldfield Beekeepers .org.uk, I think, or the British Beekeepers bbk.org.uk for a wider, if they want more information.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.